Hello, today I will be talking about Frank Zappa's links to American pop culture and an analysis of satire in early music by the Mothers of Invention. Frank Zappa was an incredibly prolific, eclectic, reactionary, and ambitious composer. Throughout his career, Zappa sought to expose issues in American society, and his commentary on these problems was extremely poignant at times. Many reviewers have remarked that the music was mean-spirited and downright depressing, or that Zappa himself was a social commentator and brilliant satirist. This divide among reviewers of Zappa's musical material can shed light on the divide that was, and in many ways still is, present in American society. One factor that should not be overlooked is that Zappa's career began in one of the most tumultuous and revolutionary times in American modern history. Essentially, Zappa had an extremely vast range of topics that he could comment on, and a voice like his was necessary to keep the public aware of the crumbling society and environment that Americans live in. This last kind of quote, the crumbling society, comes from Nick Jones' an interview with Frank Zappa in the very early stages of his career. The interview shows Zappa's intent and extends the idea that he was a social commentator even away from the musical medium. In this presentation, I will examine aspects of satire in Frank Zappa's first 3 studio releases and discuss the artist's reaction to popular culture, as well as his influence on the spread of scrutiny or dissection of a cultural climate through musical means. Through discussion of both instrumental forms of satire, later categorized as archetypal American musical icons or modules, as well as the lyrics alone, a more cohesive understanding of Zappa's tools to comment on American society can be discovered. Frank Zappa was not the first to utilize musical forms of satire, but did so in a way that was unique to him. He provided a voice for others to support in his commentary on politics, race, inequality, government, consumer culture, intellectuals, and many other subjects. In other words, no subject was off limits in the eyes of Zappa. Frank Zappa was born in 1940 in Baltimore, Maryland. His father was Italian. His mother was French and Sicilian. Frank Zappa grew up around his Italian-speaking grandparents and parents, but the language was never passed on to his generation because of his parents' desire to assimilate. After moving around the East Coast in the early part of his life, the Zappa family finally settled in Southern California in 1952. Zappa would call Southern California his home for most of his life, though his family moved many times before his musical career really started. It is here that Zappa would receive his very brief musical training in a high school band setting, and later open up his own recording studio. While Zappa's social commentary really began in the 1960s, it can be inferred that the social climate and the fact that his touring audiences didn't know how to listen gave Zappa a portrait of American society he could compare against and comment upon in his own way. That last quote, that American touring audiences didn't know how to listen, is from Arvid Ashby's very psychoanalytical and philosophical discussion of Zappa's preference in American musical culture in 1999. During this time, the 1950s into the 60s, American citizens began prospering in unprecedented ways. The Great Wars were over, and average civilians now had disposable income and could purchase houses, cars, and in some cases needed to be told what to buy. During this decade, the U.S. experienced the rise of corporate advertising, with Madison Avenue in New York City as a hub for national and international marketing. As the television set became more and more prominent in the homes of everyday people, the opportunity for advertising content to become increasingly subliminal and persuasive for the people of the U.S. was taken seriously by large corporations of the time. It was essential for Zappa to create a distinctive voice in the heterogeneous rock music culture of the late 1960s. This is just one series of events that would create the landscape of American culture in which Zappa so sharply thrived when satirizing. Since Americans now lived in a post-war era of prosperity, they had more time to develop and enjoy different types of leisure activities. One especially prominent idea in the 1950s that would come to heavily influence Zappa was the widespread consuming of science fiction films. The music in these films served to create a programmatic theme of interesting and unique sounds that would permeate the membrane of the entire film industry and influence future generations of filmmakers and composers. Sci-fi music was in Zappa's ear from a young age, and his original material could be traced, partly at least, to sounds similar to these films, and would serve as a source that Zappa continuously returned to throughout his career. This early use of an archetypal American musical icon served as a tie to the listener and their previous experiences. He would use these ties to create even more connection between the listener's thoughts and feelings on a known subject and a new subject entirely. Another important influence on Frank Zappa, especially in the early album releases, was the music of Stravinsky, Varese, and Johnny Guitar Watson. Igor Stravinsky was a composer of orchestral music that went against the grain of composers of his time. Through primitivism and with disjunct musical phrases, Stravinsky was able to subvert the usual musical expectations and also serve as a trendsetter within the role of an orchestral composer. Along with his odd meter phrases and use of primitive rhythms in the entire orchestra to create a soundscape that very much complemented the ballets they accompanied, Stravinsky used musical allusion heavily in his Russian period. He was composing Russian ballet music that used many musical quotes from Russian folk music to create connections within the mind of the listener to past experiences. In terms of the disjunct phrases and odd meter passages, the similarities between Stravinsky and Zappa are immediately noticeable. Further discussion will be given to this in the musical analysis section of my presentation. But even from Zappa's first album, Freakout, the return of the son of Monster Magnet provides very clear reference to Stravinsky's Ride of Spring Ballet and pays homage to the composer by providing similar soundscapes and musical intention. Frank Zappa revered the music of Edgar Varese and referred to him as the idol of his youth in a 1971 issue of Stereo Review. The influence of Varese began early in Zappa's life. He saw a photograph of him on an album and was drawn to his look and sound immediately. Though many of the musical elements were foreign and strange to Zappa, he loved the sounds of the percussion ensemble aspects that were demonstrated in ionization. This piece and the composer's ability to grab the attention of a young Zappa was essential to the development of his later music with regard to the percussive elements within Zappa's catalog. It is my belief that the two largest aspects of Varese that made their way into the music of Zappa was the use of very complex rhythms in succession, played by multiple performers in unison, as well as the preference of percussive elements and his later utilization of many classical percussion elements and instruments on the rock stage, such as marimba, vibraphone, bass drum, timpani, and some of the classical instruments that you see on an orchestral stage. Johnny Guitar Watson was an R&B and soul guitarist. His influence is heavily weighted in my mind because while Stravinsky and Varese influenced his style, sound, and ideas, it was Watson that led Zappa to the guitar. His music in the 1950s pioneered specific uses of effects on the electric guitar, and his R&B style of chord progressions and specific guitar technique is a model that Zappa would utilize throughout his career. The fact that Zappa so admired this musician is especially important because they would later become friends and collaborate on music, with their first studio collaboration occurring in 1975. Johnny Watson provided the vehicle that Zappa needed to break into the music scene and his commentary on the American people as the central scrutinizer. It is because he played guitar and sang that he was able to step in as in the role of band leader for the first time in 1965. Now, this brief analysis of these composers is important because it aids the examiner in understanding the kinds of tools Zappa would learn to utilize in the very early stages of his career. This appreciation and study would prove to be an important factor in the development of Zappa's music. These influences are especially poignant because each one of their characteristic sounds shines through Zappa's catalog spanning over 3 decades. As many might argue, the early influences on an artist often are the most noticeable and present. In fact, on the first release from the Mothers of Invention, Frank Zappa lists a conglomeration of artists that he credits as influences on himself and the music of Freakout. As far as Johnny Guitar Watson is concerned, one quick comment. Videos have surfaced on YouTube and other websites dedicated to Frank Zappa showing this relationship. One specifically bittersweet video shows Zappa toward the end of his life playing with a wide range of musicians, including Johnny Guitar Watson and even a Tibetan throat singing group, further showing Zappa's interest in music that was not traditional to the average American consumer. In 1965, R&B group The Soul Giants were in need of a new frontman and guitar player because of an argument that the band members had with the original leader, David Coronado, after guitarist Ray Hunt left the group. There are a few different versions of this story with slight details being changed, but this particular one is from Barry Miles' book on Frank Zappa. If Zappa was to join the group, however, it was to be understood that they would perform his original music. It was under his leadership that the band changed their name to the Mothers, hired Herb Cohen as a manager, and began working late nights on the Sunset Strip in West Hollywood. Instrumentation for the Mothers of Invention included Frank Zappa playing guitar and singing, though he never considered himself a vocalist. Roy Estrada on bass, Jimmy Carl Black playing drums, and Ray Collins as lead vocalists. Other members would be added to the mix and will be addressed in each album discussion. But this core group of 4 very different musicians would serve as the foundation for Zappa's career as a rock musician. The Mothers received a record deal under very interesting and slim circumstances. Tom Wilson, a producer for MGM, happened to be on the Sunset Strip on a night that the band was performing and was convinced by Cohen to stop by and listen to the Mothers. He walked in during Trouble Comin' Every Day, a song in the blues style, and offered them a contract on the spot. This was the working title, or the original title, of Zappa's Trouble Every Day. Not knowing that the song he heard was their only song in that style, he was definitely in for an awakening at the Mothers' first recording session. Released in 1966, Freakout was the first studio album released by the Mothers of Invention. The only addition to the group on this album from the core 4 was Elliot Ingber, who played lead and rhythm guitar. Now, there were other musicians that came in and sat in for the recording session, but they were not part of the Mothers of Invention. I will discuss evidence through musical and textual settings that displays the satirical language that Zappa employed. The first sound that the listener ever hears from Frank Zappa is a distorted guitar sound playing a lick that is remarkably similar to I Can't Get No Satisfaction by the Rolling Stones. Only a single note differs in the contour of this catchy lick that was released in 1965. I believe that the immediate use of this sound and riff shows that Zappa is already highly aware of what sells in terms of sonic pleasure for the average citizen. The first lyrics in the opening track, entitled Hungry Freaks Daddy, are Mr. America, walk on by, your schools that do not teach. This archetypal representation of a 60s rock song immediately subverts expectations because of the lyrical content. Zappa is attacking the government through its education system in a sharp manner that immediately forces the listener to decide if they agree with him. It should also be noted that Zappa is extremely critical of the education system in the United States throughout his career, most likely due to his particular experiences with high school and subsequently putting his own children through the public school system. With many rock artists of the time, the lyrical content often didn't matter as long as the sounds and the form of the song were able to fit into the mold of what was selling. A remarkable difference with Zappa is the fact that his content was not ambivalent and often took a stance toward a concept, idea, or a specific real figure. This is a partial reason his music is categorized as avant-garde rock, the content. Similar to other pieces by Zappa, Who Are the Brain Police displays satire in both musical and lyrical forms. What will you do if we let you go home? And the plastic's all melted, and so is the chrome, displays Zappa's belief that he lived in a plastic society where people don't think for themselves, and they try to fit into molds that are already established for them. In terms of musical analysis, at 1:22, the instrumental track takes an unexpected and twisted turn. This departure lasts for about 50 seconds and includes sounds of someone screaming directly into a microphone, guitar feedback, distorted voices layered upon one another, and a primitive drum groove underneath everything, ultimately leading to a return to the A section of the piece, which consists of a rock ballad waltz with more iterations of Who Are the Brain Police. Trouble Every Day is the most biting commentary on the album, in my opinion. After witnessing the Watts riots of August 1965, Zappa had actual events that he could comment upon, as well as some authority to speak through experience on matters of racial discrimination and the media exploitation of events to get ratings and share information to the public at unprecedented levels. Take your TV tube and eat it. You know I watch that rotten box until my head begins to hurt. Shows the perspective of an over-consumer of media that is being exposed to more and more bad news that seems to be coming every day. This is the only track on the Freakout album that has a blues sound and feel, enhanced by the use of harmonica and the use of electric guitar solos. It is possible that Zappa used the style of this song and its ties to black culture to further comment on society. The song is directly influenced by Johnny Guitar Watson and borrows skills and sounds that Zappa heard in this primarily black music. In 1967, Absolutely Free was released. Because of Zappa's desire to write music that was not limited to the rock band instrumentation of the time, the mothers of invention began to grow. Billy Mundy was added and credited in Absolutely Free with the drums and percussion. Don Preston played keyboards, Jim Fielder played guitar, and Buck Gardner played woodwinds, primarily saxophone, tenor, and alto. In step with the first album, Freakout gives the listener a large amount of information to process within the first few seconds of the album. Plastic People opens with Zappa introducing the President of the United States, who then begins making a speech in a very dumb voice, addressing the people with the first few notes of Louie Louie. This immediately polarizing song at the beginning of an album is consistent with the artist's intents on Freakout. Zappa takes a political stance through music and attacks the president, L.B. Johnson at the time, as well as the plastic people that support him. At 53 seconds, a Louie Louie imitative groove and contour begins. Throughout his career, Louie Louie is an archetypal American musical icon that represents the dumb, conformist, consumerist, white society. This is not to say that Zappa thought all white culture was dumb, but that he frequently noticed patterns in the young white party culture of America. Take a day and walk around. Watch the Nazis run your town. Then go home and check yourself. You think we're singing about someone else. Are lyrics from this song that show a now common view of American culture. Frank Zappa was commenting here on the inability of our culture as a whole to realize that the problems within society are closer than we think. His perspective that people walk around pretending everything is fine and great and fail to address issues of the community and country are just as relevant today. The current social and political climate is simply a product of plasticity. In Status Back Baby, Zappa returns his critical focus to the school, though this time on the culture rather than the lack of education. His perspective is one of many others, saying that the school culture greatly magnifies all of the activities that happen within the school without preparing the students for what they need once they get out. A bunch of pom-pom girls look down their noses at me, hints at the ridiculous hierarchy of high schools, and a possible glimpse into Zappa's own experiences with being made to feel degraded by those with more influence and popularity than he. I hear the secret whispers everywhere I go. My school spirit's at an all-time low. Furthers this idea and portrays the feeling that others listening may possibly identify with these things. The musical satire comes from the fact that this piece is such an uplifting and happy-sounding song, but the content does not reflect this. The light rock shuffle with singable guitar riffs are not indicative of the satirical lyrics that Zappa employs. Once again, the expectations of the listener are subverted through this specific method that Zappa would continue to utilize in much of his music. Another departure in this song, a rock version of Stravinsky's Petrushka, both exposes the listener to this classical music composer, as well as divulges the influence of Stravinsky on Zappa. While other rock groups were adapting entire symphonic works for the rock stage, Zappa was more inclined to simply quote the works in small portions throughout his career. This could also be an example of satire because Zappa's vocal opinion that all music was the same and should be treated the same, and that there should be no hierarchy of music. In 1967, Frank Zappa also released Lumpy Gravy, but for purposes of this discussion, I will focus solely on music by the Mothers of Invention. In 1968, the Mothers of Invention released We're Only In It for the Money under the Verve label. The personnel changed slightly from the previous year by adding Ian Underwood to the mix, playing keyboards and woodwinds. This album features some satire available to anyone reading the title and or noticing the cover image. Without playing a note, Zappa's title of We're Only In It for the Money highlights his understanding that his sincerity and the fact that he can be upfront with his intentions might cause the consumer to listen to someone real over the fake and plastic popular music scene that Zappa was scrutinizing. People might also be drawn to this album because of the visual similarities between the album and the Beatles' recent release, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Released only months before this album, Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band was an early version of a popular concept album that included a wide range of musical sources. Influenced by psychedelic drugs, this album charted for many weeks in the UK and in the US. Zappa's critique of the album on We're Only In It for the Money attacked psychedelic drugs as well as the people who used them in Who Needed the Peace Corps. Every town must have a place where phony hippies meet. Psychedelic Dungeons, popping up on every street, shows his dislike of hippies and hippie culture. Psychedelic Dungeons referred to the fact that once corporate America caught up with the trend of hippie culture, they began selling it back to them. Stores began appearing, especially in California, where stereotypical hippie garb was sold. He attacked hippies, as well as the phony hippies, who were simply caught up in the trend without any substance in the movement, or without personal discovery of that substance, if there was any. One particular revealing line about Zappa's feelings toward the love movement is, I will have a psychedelic gleam in my eye at all times. I will love everyone. I will love the police as they kick the shit out of me on the street. Zappa was satirizing hippie culture in this line, as well as the fact that police brutality was still a real and present threat in the US. In Flower Punk, Zappa dedicates a whole nother song to the idea that the hippie culture is running rampant. Hey punk, where are you going with your button on your shirt? I'm going to the Love-In to sit down and play my bongos in the dirt. shows Zappa's ability to draw on the stereotypical behaviors associated with hippies to let the listener know what he opposes: hippies, drugs, drug culture, laziness, and conformity of any kind, amongst others. Mom and Dad satirizes the police brutality mentioned earlier, as well as the apathetic tendencies of American citizens after news of these tragedies is received. The cops have shot some boys and girls. You'll sit at home and drink all night. They look too weird to serve them right. Zappa is commenting here on the judgment that is so quickly placed on people who look different than what is depicted on TV as being normal. Part of the reason these allegorical characters are being killed is because of their appearances. Shot by the cops as she quietly lay by the side of the creeps she knew, they killed her too. Shows the view that is still very present today. Police can murder unarmed civilians with impunity and with arbitrary reasons for doing so. Zappa is also perhaps saying that the culture the victims are associated with is partly the cause of her death, or at least that the public's view and reaction to these subgroups of freaks and creeps is the cause of some of the discord in our society. Ever take a minute to show real emotion in between the moisture cream and velvet face lotion? Shows the perspective that consumerism and America's obsession with things and stuff disrupts our ability to connect with one another, feel empathy for someone's different situation, and it distracts citizens from real problems in society. The idea of mom and dad comes from Zappa's view that the older generation in charge of us all is the source of many problems in society as well. Going back to Freakout, the daddy term refers to the great generation that won all the wars but let their youth slip through the cracks and develop this counterculture they so vehemently abhor. Once again, this perpetuates the idea that average citizens of the U.S. are unable or unwilling to look introspectively and address issues, and instead they deny the presence of these problems in their own neighborhoods. Overall, Frank Zappa set a trend by satirizing many subjects in government systems, politics, popular culture, and many others. His desire to expose hypocrisy in leadership and society allowed him to examine issues that were affecting him as well as other citizens of the U.S., with a degree of separation that made his criticisms more valid. Sure, he was part of the music industry that had something to do with this downward slope in American culture, but Zappa saw himself more as an outside party commenting on his own peers. Now, I have made comments of my understanding of Zappa's perspective and his approach through the medium of the Mothers of Invention. Though there are many other examinations of this music, I attempted to comment on similarities between some of the specific songs on the first three albums. It can be seen that Frank Zappa's satire was effective in its intent and set a level of criticism and dissection that is unmatched by most artists. His ties to American popular culture come in the form of an infinite pool of subject material and is exhibited by his desire to point out the hypocrisy of those in power, those leading people astray, or simply stupid people doing stupid things. Thank you.